All right, guys, last section here on the Jefferson-Tyler study guide. And I'm just going to be honest with you. This last part's kind of challenging because there's so many different reformers, and it's really hard sometimes to nail down what their focus is because a lot of them are involved in different types of reform. Most of the time, if they are for women's rights, they're also for the abolition of slavery. And a lot of times, if they're for women's rights, they are part of the temperance movement as well. So or if they're part of the religious group. So a lot of times they kind of cross over into different types of reform areas. So what I would do if I were you is just cement your understanding of one of the big ones for each sort of movement. So like when you think abolition, think Frederick Douglass. When you think temperance, think Lyman Beecher or Father Leopold Matthew. When you think suffrage, think about the Seneca Falls Convention. Think about Susan B. Anthony. Religion, or education, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young. That's an easy one to remember. Think, Horace Mann with public education. So, try to attach yourself to one of these. Hopefully, your speed date activity allowed you to attach to a few you thought were very interesting. And generally speaking, just the utopians. Those are experiments essentially that are very much radical when you look at actual society. Uh, People were just trying out different things to see if capitalism really was necessary, if like typical ideas of matrimony were necessary, analyzing sex and its relationship with people and how we act. So some strange things happening in some of these utopias, and most of these utopias sort of died out because when people aren't making babies, they kind of die out. So I'm just going to go over the general things here. And again, the biggest thing would be to just attach yourself to one or two of these. Don't try to memorize every single one of these. I don't think it's possible. And again, it's kind of confusing because they do kind of blend over into other reform movements. But understand that this time period, the Jeffersonian, or I'm sorry, Jacksonian era, 1830s, 1840s. This is what we call the Second Great Awakening. We got the market revolution going on. We got expansion of suffrage. Lots of important things happening here, and these reform movements are only possible because of a lot of these market revolution improvements, things like the telegraph and faster transportation and things like that allow movements, ideas to move quickly too, not just goods. So let's just start with utopias. This comes of the transcendentalist movement. Literature's growing, and you have utopian, or these ideas of perfect societies that are very different than traditional capitalist, monogamous, nuclear family sort of society. So Robert Dale Owens, he is one that establishes a utopian society called New Harmony, and he gets a bunch of scientists and natural philosophers to kind of gather and just, really talk about, you know, uh, really the necessities of life, and not really focus on capitalism and gaining money. Religious leader, interesting, Dr. Sylvester Graham. He is going to focus on vegetarianism, temperance. He's going to later inspire things like the graham cracker and graham flour and things like that. John Humphrey Noyes, he's the founder of a utopian community called Oneida. And this community, this is really kind of interesting. This community gets together in committee and determines procreation, who's going to have kids, when you can do the act of procreation. And then afterward, families, when they have kids, for the first couple of years, mothers are raising their own kids, but then it becomes a community thing. So interesting idea that kind of dies out. And then George Ripley, the last one here, purely secular utopia, not really tied to religion, but again, just interesting attempts to recreate functioning society outside of the hustle and bustle of capitalism and factory systems and all those things. Okay, so we look at religion and education. Mother Ann Lee Stanley, she kind of crosses from utopia over into religion. She's one of the founders of the Shaker movement, who focus on abstinence, not doing the deed to create more families. And so what happens to the Shakers? They kind of die out. Okay, we have in the 1830s we have a Mormon migration from eastern cities. They're pushed away because of their religious beliefs, and they're pushed westward. And the Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, create communities in places like Utah. But more importantly, they establish trade routes, communities, and a sense of structure in the West that wasn't there before, and that's going to continue afterward when America finally catches up to them in like the 1850s and 60s. Okay, Emma Willard, she's going to be the founder of Troy University. It's the first school for women's higher education. Horace Mann is the father of really public education. He helps establish the public school system through state taxes. William McGuffey is going to help as well. He's going to create a standardization as far as textbooks for elementary and secondary education. Thomas Gallaudet is going to establish the first U.S. school for the deaf. Dr. Samuel Howe is going to help establish the school for the blind. And then this goes back to the Enlightenment time period, long, long ago in Europe. We have lyceums, which are discussion halls, debate halls. So we start to see, people taking a prominent role in speeches and moving people in these debate halls and town hall sessions, essentially. Okay. When we look at women's rights, you're looking at this list here and you're thinking Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Those are big ones, okay? But again, a lot of these women's rights activists bleed over into other areas, specifically when it comes to abolition. Lucretia Mott, she's going to go to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. She meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton there. They become friends. At the convention, they're denied participation in this anti-slavery convention. So they kind of, remain friends after this. 8 years later, they have the Seneca Falls Convention where they focus on women's right to vote. Okay, they published this paper called Declarations of Rights and Sentiments, which focuses on a lot of rights for women, but primarily what comes out of this is the push for women's suffrage. Okay. Susan B. Anthony, she was raised in a Quaker household. She's inspired with this Quaker idea of equality. She was friends to Frederick Douglass and William Lord Garrison. We already know how instrumental she is in pushing for women's suffrage. Dorothea Dix is going to help create mental asylums. She also was a nurse during the American Civil War. Elizabeth Blackwell becomes the first female doctor in the United States. Okay. Margaret Fuller is going to write a very important work called Women or Woman in the 19th Century, and she is going to encourage women to sort of break away from those stereotypical, home roles. Women should seek independence outside the home through education. Moving on to abolitionists, the Grimke sisters, they are going to take some pretty big risks. They're going to speak openly against slavery and become renowned for that. Frederick Douglass, of course, is probably the biggest abolition to remember. He was a slave. He is a primary source. He writes a book, very important book called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. He sort of, brought himself out of slavery, escaped, becomes well educated, world famous orator. Another famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. Why he matters is he takes the words of others and publishes them in a very famous newspaper called The Liberator. And so we start to see the ideas of emancipation and abolition spread across the United States. Okay, Harriet Beecher Stowe, one of the first mass-produced novels, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is published, which really spreads the idea of abolition around the country in what people assumed was a fictional work, but it just spurs more ideas about abolition. Okay, Sojourner Truth, she's kind of in the middle between abolition and women's rights. She has a very famous speech publication called Ain't I a Woman, promoting for the emancipation of slaves as well as women's rights. Elijah P. Lovejoy, he is I want to say he was Presbyterian. I think I read that right. Presbyterian, who would give these anti-slavery speeches. He was killed and becomes sort of a martyr for anti-slavery. Okay. There is also a movement that becomes supported by politicians where, it's not anti-slavery, it's essentially like removal from the United States. Newly freed slaves should go back to Africa. So we have this American Colonization Society, which sets up, in Africa, a colony called Liberia. And there are a few Africans who actually go there, but there are people who speak out against this as well, saying, newly freed blacks should have the same rights as whites. Okay. We'll get into this more into the next unit, but Nat Turner's Rebellion happens during this Jacksonian era time, 1831. It's a violent slave rebellion, very radical attempt at emancipation, where slaves go on a rampage, killing like 150 whites, actually. But what actually ended up happening actually worked to further limit the opportunities of slaves and free people of color to get educated. And so their laws begin because of Nat Turner's rebellion that forbid teaching slaves or even newly freed black people things like literacy. Okay. Temperance is another evil that gets addressed here. Lyman Beecher, he's the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. He's actually the father of 11 reformers of his time. He is going to help found this American Temperance Society. And again, temperance is the idea that we should limit or ban alcohol. And of course, it matters a whole lot later too when we get into the 1920s and 30s with, prohibition. This all starts really in Europe with Father Leopold Matthew. He's an Irish priest. He's the father of temperance. We get a term from him and his movements called teetotalist. If you're a teetotaler, you were against the consumption of alcohol. Neil Dow is just another one of these guys. He works for the abolition of alcohol or the prohibition of alcohol, excuse me, in Maine, and sort of forms his own society up there and gets nationwide recognition. So these are really the three guys to know when it comes to temperance. I think if you know Lyman Beecher, it helps you understand, his reform movement, and then it kind of helps you go on and learn about Harriet Beecher Stowe and those guys. And then finally, we did our Shark Tank presentations on the market revolution. So know, sort of the founders of each. We looked at these. You guys got information on these. Canals connecting waterways. George DeWitt I'm sorry, DeWitt Clinton is going to be in charge of this Erie Canal. We'll get this built in 1825. It connects the Hudson River and Lake Erie. It's going to vastly improve trade. The Telegraph by Samuel Morse. We had markets, but now connections with those markets are now instantaneous. And we read an article about this, changes wrought by cotton, that it wasn't necessarily a market revolution, it was a communication revolution. Faster communication, more efficient communication, more responsive communication, more fair communication. Remember that prior to the telegraph, ports in New England had an advantage because they could respond to worldwide market conditions before the South and before the West. So this really helps change things. Okay, steamboats allow us to transport cargo and people now upriver so much faster. Turnpikes or improved toll roads, railroads. We start to get a movement into the West, into the Louisiana Purchase territory. And remember, all these things are going to help spread these social movements, more interconnectivity between regions. They're going to spur on things like the invention of the clock, where people work by the hour, not the sun. We have the introduction of the wage worker. We also have people working outside their home for the first time in factories. Okay, women and children have the opportunity to work, and they're not great, working conditions, but they do get opportunities. Okay, the factory system. You need to know Francis Lau is sort of the founder of the American factory system, but also understand that Samuel Slater, he brings a lot of these ideas, to America. He's sort of the father, Samuel Slater, the father of the first American Industrial Revolution in 1789, and Francis Lau builds upon that. The cotton gin helps us improve the efficiency of picking out the seeds from that short, stable cotton. And in the expansion of cotton allows slavery to grow, causes slavery to grow. Now slaves are not pulling out and refining the cotton. Now more slaves are in the fields getting more supply of cotton to be refined, and therefore more supply for northern industries. So we start to see interconnectivity grow between northern industries who produce the cotton and, of course, the southern agricultural farms that grow it. Okay, and of course, the steel plow is another big one. We're not using wooden plows or iron plows. More reliable plow that allows a small-time farmer to really create more workable soil in rocky areas in the Northeast, and of course, with more territory available in the West, we're going to have the steel plow being used in Western farming as well, taming the Great Plains. Okay, so the last thing on your sheet here, we've got all presidents, their party, and you're elected. All presidents up to really William Henry Harrison or John Tyler. We're gonna segue and blend from John Tyler into our next unit when we get into westward expansion and manifest destiny and the acquisition of Texas and things like bleeding Kansas and things like that. So we're going to stop with Tyler here, but we are going to pick back up and kind of resume some things from Tyler. So I'll remind you of the presidential chart that I told you that was in Canvas. So you filled out the chart, and I said to work on it, and I told you there was a key in Canvas. So understand that you do need to know like the dates that presidents were elected, their parties, and of course major events and foreign policy and others, wars, things like that. So make sure you look at this. You need to know from Jefferson really all the way to Tyler. Some of them you have a lot of information for: George Washington, Andrew Jackson. One of the things that we didn't talk about a lot in class was Andrew Jackson felt like, you know, um, American infrastructure being forced upon the states was a bad idea. Americans being forced to pay tariffs to support American industry to fund infrastructure projects was unconstitutional. So Jackson actually vetoes the Maysville Road, which was an attempt to do just that. Okay, so you could say that that was Andrew Jackson supporting states' rights. That's a great example of that. Okay. Two more things that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but I'll just tell you what they were. We got to the very end. William Henry Harrison dies within a month of taking office. John Tyler takes over. Well, one of the I guess accomplishments or events that happens under John Tyler at the very beginning is we have this dispute. It's somewhat of a violent dispute between the United Kingdom and America with regard to where the border is, sort of at in Maine, so that our northeastern border. So we have a small series of conflicts called the Aroostook War between the United Kingdom and the United States. And eventually this gets settled, and we have an actual border between Canada and the United States on the northeast portion of Maine through something called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. Okay, so again, please know this. There are about 15 questions on your test from this chart. So please make sure you know it. That is all I have. Hope you guys have an awesome day. Deuces.